Welcome everyone. I'm Bob Russell. I'm the E.N.G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science here at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley at CTNS, founder and director of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this third fall Zoom public forum. And it's become a real blessing for us to have this Zoom version because we've got people from across the states and sometimes around the world. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for participating. I want to say a special thanks to Melissa Morris and Braden Mullick for staffing this event, making it possible so I can just enjoy being the host. And they do all the wonderful background work so it actually works. Thank you both so much. You're great. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, my good friend Ted Davis, I want to ask Braden to say a word or two about the process tonight for our interaction. Braden, do you want to take it?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, we would just ask that you would keep your microphone on mute while Ted is speaking, and then afterward we'll have some time for question and answer. And the best way to do that, or the most efficient way I find, is that if you click under participants at the bottom of your screen, a list should pop up on the right, and there should be an option for you that says raise hand. And that's a clear way for me to tell that you have a question. If you have a problem doing it that way, please feel free to send me a private message or to throw into the chat that I have a question, and I will try and keep things on a list and make sure that we can have an ordered discussion. I would ask you would try and keep your question concise while you're asking, because we do have a number of people that would probably like to participate. We're also pretty casual at the GTU in general, so I will tend to refer to people by their first name. If that bothers you, please let me know and tell me how I should address you. I think that's about it. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, Braden, thank you. So Professor Ted Davis is Distinguished Professor of the History of Science at Messiah University. He's a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion and advisor to forthcoming exhibits at the National Museum of American History and the Museum of the Bible. He is author of dozens of articles and essays about Christianity and science in the Scientific Revolution and modern America. His book about the religious activities and beliefs of prominent American scientists from the period between the two world wars will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press. On a personal note, I've known Ted for decades. Ted, I don't even remember when we first met. maybe you do, but I'm so grateful for Ted's real scholarship and leadership in this field. You know, we're in a strange world where even in scholarship there are so many myths. I know I fall prey to them too. But as a distinguished historian, Ted keeps me honest. And he's been gracious enough to sit in on the class Ted Peters and I are teaching this fall, and has called me on the carpet several times when I've uttered a truth that was actually a fallacy. And I will change my text. But I mean, I really appreciate, Ted, your incredible scholarship and the enormous amount of time and energy it takes, and your dedication as a Christian to the common truth that we all share. That is just such a blessing. So into the mix of theology and science comes Ted. Ted, thank you for tonight, and tell me why science is good for Christianity.
Well, Bob, I really appreciate the opportunity to have an audience of people who are really interested in this kind of thing, and who I'm sure will be asking some very good questions. Let me briefly explain the context in which the original version of this talk was given. It's not identical to the one I'm going to do tonight, but close enough. A number of years ago, I was asked to do a debate in front of a large student organization at Oregon State. It's a debate society called the Socratic Club. And they always have these monthly debates, apparently, on issues related to theism and unbelief. They are sponsored by many of the campus religious organizations, including the campus Atheists, who were out in force that night. And my opponent that evening was a local secular humanist minister who's recently passed away. He took, of course, the side that Christianity is not good for science and made an argument along those lines. And then we had an interesting conversation amongst us and then with the audience afterward. So in that context, what I wanted to do was to put forth the positive argument for this and avoid obvious objections, etc., leaving it to my opponent and the audience to raise those, and a number of people did. So I'm going to just do that. It's not in that way a formal academic argument where I would consider reasonable objections and such. It will just be the positive case for why I believe Christianity is good for science. Okay, so let me put some slides up. Oh, I need to be able to, Bob, I need to be able to put my slides up. I can't seem to do it. It says that I'm disabled for that.
Okay, Braden should be able to make you host so you can share screen. Braden, is that right?
Yeah, we had it set that one participant could share at a time, but we only had the host sharing, not all participants. So you should be good to go now.
Thanks, Braden. There it is.
Okay. This is the opening image, by the way, is my all-time favorite picture of God and creation. It is an old, well, not so old white guy in this case, but it's this particular illustration is a manuscript illustration from the Austrian National Library from the 13th century, and at the height, really, of the revival of Platonism in the West, and you can see that in this particular cutaway view of the unformed cosmos from probably Genesis 1 verse 2 or something like that, where God is indeed a mathematician, as I believe God is, among other attributes of God. But that'll be evident tonight. Sadly, the public conversation about religion and science today is often dominated by shrill, uninformed voices who demonize and insult their opponents, marginalize alternative views in an effort to polarize, and bend the truth until it breaks. We can do a lot better than that. As an historian of science with particular expertise in science and religion, I have a different view of this than many other commentators. Although the historical landscape is not entirely absent of conflicts involving religion and science, the general picture is substantially unlike the popular conception of ongoing, inevitable conflict that is promoted by certain preachers of atheism. Quite the opposite. I will argue that Christian faith often complements the picture of the world coming from the sciences, helping us to achieve a deeper understanding of both the way the world is and how we should go about understanding it, while providing a powerful motive for investigating nature. The Christian doctrine of creation helps us to understand more of reality than science alone can study, including the very possibility of science itself as a form of knowledge about nature. Now, the tone of my position is no less important than the content. I'm not trying to show that every open-minded, well-informed, rational person must draw the same conclusions. There are no slam dunk answers to jump shot questions, and questions about the existence of God, the intelligibility of nature, or the meaning of life are of just that sort. The enormous success of science in explaining so many features of the natural world is partly a result of limiting its methods and scope to things that can be measured and tested against nature, deliberately leaving all other matters to one side, but not, in my view, debunking those matters as meaningless. Now, Richard Dawkins vehemently disagrees with the point I just made about not debunking those matters as meaningless. When he asked himself at a Christmas lecture at the Royal Institution in London, what is the meaning of life? This was his answer. If science has nothing to say, it's certain that no other discipline can say anything at all. The arrogance of such a claim, dismissing in 17 words the significance of all art, music, literature, and everything else that any person has ever thought about the question, apart from science, is staggering. However, Dawkins doesn't really speak for the whole scientific community when he says such things. He speaks only for himself and those who happen to agree with him. For a different opinion, let's turn to the late Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate biologist who, like Dawkins, did not believe in God. The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. So it is to a few of those first and last things that I want to turn now. I'll start with a famous statement from the greatest scientist of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. He was referring implicitly to two different aspects of nature, its regularity and the fact that our minds can delve deeply into it, producing a coherent picture of reality. Both are prerequisites for the very possibility of doing science, and they happen to match perfectly the biblical notion of creation. But what exactly do I mean by creation? An idea that might easily be misunderstood if I don't spell it out more fully. Here I turn to Christopher Kaiser, a Harvard-trained astrophysicist and theologian who puts it like this. The basic idea of creation in Scripture is that the entire universe is subject to a code of law which was established at the beginning of time. This idea has two major implications for our view of the world. One, nature functions with a high degree of autonomy, where that word autonomy literally means having its own laws. And second, the natural world is comprehended by God, and therefore comprehensible to human beings created in the divine image. Now, I lack time to expand on Kaiser's claim with specific passages from the Bible and the great theologians. Suffice it to say that the term lex naturae, law of nature, Latin, appears very early in Christian thought, no later than the 4th century, when Ambrose used it in his Latin paraphrase of Basil's Hexameron. Christian theologians made the concept commonplace long before scientists picked up the term. Precisely because it has such strong theological overtones, philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright, a prominent atheist, has even recommended that scientists stop using the language and concept of laws of nature altogether. As she says, without God, there cannot be laws of nature, nor anything else with their crucial characteristics. I think she's right. Now, Cartwright's conclusion flatly contradicts a widely publicized claim made by astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, a self-described anti-theist. According to Krauss, advances in cosmology and particle physics have made it clear that there's a plausible case for understanding precisely how a universe full of stuff, like the universe we live in, could result literally from nothing by natural processes. And therefore, we don't need a creator. Frankly, this is all bluster. Krauss's pronouncement goes far beyond science, immersing him in philosophical and theological waters that are much deeper than he realizes. David Albert, an atheistic philosopher of physics at Columbia, deftly exposed Krauss's astonishing naivete in the New York Times, concluding that none of Krauss's ideas amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. Physicist Paul Davies is equally unimpressed by claims of this sort. It is all very well proclaiming that the laws of physics plus the cosmic initial conditions explain the universe. But this begs the question of where those laws and conditions came from in the first place. Science may be powerfully successful in explaining the universe, but how do we explain science? Why does science, based on the notion of external laws of physics, work, and work so well? Many natural laws are expressed mathematically. The great astronomer James Jeans once said that as our knowledge advanced, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. This feature of the universe also has strong theological overtones, leading countless Jewish and Christian scientists to quote a creation text from the Book of Wisdom. And if I could add, I suspect, I have a hunch that of all the verses in biblical scripture that are quoted by scientists who are Jewish or Christian, this might be first. And the text comes again from the Book of Wisdom, which of course is apocryphal in the Jewish and Protestant traditions, but canonical in Catholic tradition. And it reads as follows: "Thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight." Now, it is not simply the fact that the universe can be understood then. Something else even more remarkable is going on here, something about how we understand it. Many years ago, Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner wrote a famous paper with a fascinating title that many in this chat room here will know, namely, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. If you don't know that paper, look for that title online and you'll find several PDF versions of it. As Wigner said, the enormous usefulness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. With mathematics, we can probe very deeply into matter and far out into the universe in ways that are completely unanticipated, yet incredibly accurate. Wigner puts it like this: the mathematical formulation of the physicist's often crude experience leads in an uncanny number of cases to an amazingly accurate description of a large class of phenomena. This shows that the mathematical language has more to commend it than being the only language which we can speak. It shows that it is, in a very real sense, the correct language. A long time ago, nearly 50 years ago, when I was a little younger than I am now, I was a research assistant for Seth Shostak at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. Seth is now the director of the SETI project, based out there in California. Some of you may know him. Seth does not believe in God. However, as John Barrow has noted, the whole SETI project assumes that mathematics is a universal language. Carl Sagan obviously thought so, judging from his novel Contact, in which extraterrestrial beings make their presence known to us by using the prime number sequence. This could only be possible if mathematics is the same at other times, as well as in other places. The seemingly universal presence of mathematics in nature is a profound fact about our encounter with the universe, and it cries out for a deeper explanation. If mathematics is merely a human invention, and our minds are nothing more than the product of a blind evolutionary process that guarantees only our survival, not the truth of our mathematical propositions, then why do our equations describe nature so well? As Paul Davis has observed, survival depends on an appreciation of how the world is, not of any hidden underlying order. Certainly, it cannot depend on the hidden order within atomic nuclei, or in black holes, or in subatomic particles that are produced on Earth only inside particle accelerator machines. All of this suggests that mathematics has some element of transcendence about it, suggesting in turn the possibility of a transcendent cause of the match between mathematics and matter. Is it perhaps the case, as Jeans, Kepler, Galileo, and Copernicus believed, that God is a mathematician? Here I'm with physicist John Polkinghorne, who says there is no a priori reason why beautiful equations should prove to be the clue to understanding nature, why fundamental physics should be possible. why our minds should have such ready access to the deep structure of the universe. It is a contingent fact that this is true of us and our world, but it does not seem sufficient simply to regard it as a happy accident. Surely, it is a significant insight into the nature of reality. Whether mathematical or not, scientific laws summarize an enormous body of observations, giving them conceptual shape, while helping us to predict the results of future observations. They arise out of the interplay of reason and experience that lies at the heart of modern science. Though few scientists today are aware of it, there are actually deep connections between theism and the idea that we ought to learn about nature first and foremost by going out and observing it. Living at a time when we're confronted with enormously speculative claims about an inconceivable number of undetectable universes, it's worth remembering something that Galileo's spokesman, Salviati, said to Simplicio in his famous book about the Copernican system. Specifically, our discourses must relate to the sensible world and not to one on paper. In our own day, the great cosmologist George Ellis has said exactly the same thing in response to Sean Carroll's recommendation that we should accept the multiverse hypothesis even without being able to test it empirically. As Ellis points out, Carroll is basically saying that the rules for doing good science have changed. This is moving the goalposts, says Ellis. Instead of belief in a scientific theory increasing when observational evidence arises to support it, he suggests that theoretical discoveries alone bolster belief. But conclusions arising logically from mathematics need not apply to the real world. Experiments have proved many beautiful and simple theories wrong. One vestige of the theology underlying the modern scientific attitude is the presence in most scientific papers of the two words facts, F-A-C-T-S, and data, D-A-T-A. They come from Latin words meaning made and given, silently reminding us that the facts pertain to the things that God has made, and the data are given to us by the author of nature. To take this idea further, I call on Alexander Koyré, a Jewish scholar of great erudition, whose influence on the history of science in the 20th century was nothing short of profound. I knew many historians, including my own advisor, Sam Westphal, the great Newton scholar, who thought that Koyré was the supreme historian of science of the century. And I tend to agree. Reflecting insightfully on the foundational concepts that underlie Newton's science, Koyré wrote this: as we see, empiricism and metaphysics, and even a very definite kind of metaphysics, the creationist, are closely linked together. What other means indeed, but observation and experience, can we possibly use for the study of a world freely created by an infinite God? During the scientific revolution, a great debate took place between the empiricists and the rationalists, and there was a crucial theological component. The rationalists, such as René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Leibniz, held that reason alone was sufficient to discover the fundamental laws of nature. And I'm reminded that in the next century, Kant thought that Newton's laws were a priori truths, a view which I think one of the other mathematicians did do, maybe it was Euler, maybe it was someone else, who held a very similar view of this, I don't recall. But the point is that that's what they thought. Reason alone is enough. You can find the basic laws of nature can be discovered from reason alone, pure reason. The empiricists, including Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, held that science could not be done in an armchair. Observation and experiment were essential components. This irreducible difference of opinion shines through something that Leibniz told Christian Huygens. Mr. Boyle spends too much time, to be truthful, drawing from an infinity of splendid experiments, no other conclusions than those which he could have taken for principles of nature. which one can verify to be true from reason alone, whereas experiments, no matter how numerous, cannot prove them. And indeed they can't. They can't, as Leibniz understood and as Hume understood very well the next century. This is the problem of induction. You can't arrive at certainty with induction. And yet that's what science needs, induction. Now, what did Christian theology have to do with this debate about how science should be done? Well, consider what the ancient physician Galen had written, comparing the Greek notion of God and creation to that of the Hebrews. Our opinion, and that of Plato and of the other Greeks who follow the right method in science, differs from the position taken up by Moses, he said. For Moses, it seems enough to say that God simply willed the arrangement of matter, and it was presently arranged in due order. For he believes everything to be possible with God. We Greeks, however, do not hold this. We say that certain things are impossible by nature, and that God does not even attempt such things at all, but that he only chooses the best out of the possibilities of becoming. Sounds like Leibniz, doesn't he? In other words, Moses' God is free to do things outside the box in which Galen and the Greeks put their gods. In exactly the same way, the rationalists of Boyle's day felt that the author of nature would never write surprise endings. Listen to these words from the preface to Isaac Newton's famous Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. The business of true philosophy is to derive the natures of things from causes truly existent, and to inquire after those laws on which the great creator actually chose to found this most beautiful frame of the world, not those by which he might have done the same, had he so pleased. Anyone presumptuous enough to think that he can learn the laws of nature from pure reason must either suppose that the world exists by necessity. I'm hearing that peg mark around here somewhere. That the world exists by necessity, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed. Or, if the order of nature was established by the will of God, that himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was fittest to be done. Robert Boyle, who helped create the modern laboratory and its methods, said exactly the same thing. For if we believe God to be the author of things, it is rational to conceive that he may have made them commensurate rather to his own designs in them than to the notions we men may best be able to frame of them. The author of nature consulted not in the production of things with human capacities, but first made things in such manner as he was pleased to think fit, and afterwards left human understandings to speculate as well as they could. Another example comes from Michael Faraday, one of the most important scientists who has ever lived, and one of the most intensely religious. Late Cornell historian L. Pierce Williams wrote the standard scientific biography of Faraday. I knew Williams. He was a very interesting person. He had changed his name. He was a Jewish American. He had changed his name back in the 30s or so to avoid academic discrimination. But he was an unapologetic atheist. And even he, nevertheless, notes with admiration how Faraday drew more than strength from his religion. It gave him both a sense of the necessary unity of the universe, derived from the unity and benevolence of its creator, and a profound sense of the fallibility of man. Both are worth stressing. The origins of field theory are to be found in Faraday's detailed experimental researches on electricity, but the speculations and imaginings which led him to publish physical heresies owe something to his unquestioning belief in the unity and interconnections of all phenomena. This belief, in turn, derived from his faith in God as both creator and sustainer of the universe. As with each of these examples, for centuries, Christian theology has been closely linked with a humble attitude toward human knowledge and a genuine openness to finding holy and unanticipated even seemingly irrational things in nature. And this is surely conducive to doing good science. Indeed, we have an identical opinion from none other than Thomas Henry Huxley, famously known as Darwin's bulldog, for his eagerness to defend Darwin's theory of evolution when it was still a brand new idea in the mid-19th century. Huxley was no Christian. He coined the word agnostic to describe his own position, but he understood that science and Christianity have this much in common. Science seems to me to teach in the highest and strongest manner the great truth which is embodied in the Christian conception of entire surrender to the will of God. Sit down before fact as a little child. Be prepared to give up every preconceived notion. Follow humbly wherever and to whatever abysses nature leads, or you shall learn nothing. The relevance of the Christian understanding of creation for doing science should now be evident, but I will conclude with a complementary observation. Doing science enhances the Christian life, making one a better disciple of Jesus Christ. Hear Boyle's palpable excitement in this passage about the telescope. Though heaven be an object that has been perpetually and conspicuously opposed to man's view and curiosity, to man's view and curiosity for some thousands of years, yet it still affords new subjects for their wonder. And I scarce doubt that by the farther improvement of telescopes, posterity will have its curiosity gratified by the discovery both of new constellations and of new stars in those constellations that are known to us already. We need not therefore fear that our admiration of God should expire for want of objects fit to keep it up. That boundless ocean contains a variety of excellent objects that is as little to be exhausted as the creatures that live in our sublunary ocean or lie on the shores that limit it can be numbered. Yet this pales in comparison with the sheer rapture that fills Kepler's works from cover to cover. For it is precisely the universe, which is that book of nature, in which God the Creator has revealed and depicted his essence, and what he wills with man in a wordless script. Or as he said on another occasion, since we astronomers are priests of the Most High God with respect to the book of nature, it behooves us that we do not aim at the glory of our own spirit, but above everything else, at the glory of God. Christianity encourages scientists to seek the glory of God and the charitable service of our fellow human beings, rather than self-aggrandizement, which is an ever-present danger for top scientists. As Boyle realized, the higher degree of knowledge that the scientist attains seems more likely to puff him up than to make him humble. And Boyle noted how the challenges of laboratory life could teach one humility instead. This reminds me of Bacon's famous advice about the book of God's word and the book of God's works, namely that we should endeavor an endless progress or proficiency in both. Only let men beware that they apply both to charity and not to swelling, to use and not to ostentation, and again that they do not unwisely mingle or confound these learnings together. I close now with Boyle's advice to other scientists. In an age when so many allow differences of opinion to degenerate into vulgar name-calling, Boyle was indeed a man before his time. Railing at a man's person, he said, or wrangling about his words is a quarrelsome and injurious way of writing that does very much misbecome both a philosopher and a Christian. Thank you for your kindness in listening to those words tonight. I'm interested now to hear from you.
Thank you, Ted. Wonderful. Okay, we have time for Q&A, and Braden's going to moderate. So Braden, take it away.
Sure. Just as a reminder, if you weren't here at the beginning of the talk, the easiest way for me to know that you have a question is to click on the Participants tab and then to click on the button that says raise hand. But if that is also a problem, you can feel free to shoot me a private message or to write in the chat that you have a question. Looks like we have a question from Bill Phillips. Go ahead.
Okay, Ted, thanks for that lovely talk. That was really great. You touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you might expand on the idea that is often brought up, that science, for all its claims about being completely based on reason, in fact has unstated assumptions without which it couldn't work at all. In other words, assumptions such as the universe is capable of being understood. At least I've heard that argument given any number of times, and I've felt a lot of affinity toward that argument. But at the same time, I wonder, doesn't the successful operation of science help to continually verify that unstated assumption? I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that question.
Yeah, I agree with you. But as with many metaphysical questions or assumptions that are embedded within science, I think my sense is that quite a few modern scientists don't think about this. That they might be unconsciously living with these assumptions, whatever they may be. Those certainly are assumptions. One could say, perhaps with some justification, that we don't need to worry about understanding why the universe ought to be understandable. We know that it is.
Right.
Point. But it's been a long road to get here. But indeed, why should that be true? You want to ask the prior question. You want to ask the larger metaphysical question. Why shouldn't that surprise us? Why should we not be surprised that the universe can be comprehended? And yet, why should we not be surprised that the universe cannot be entirely comprehended? And so, I would suggest that the Christian doctrine of creation is about that. The degree to which we share the mind of God as part of the image of God is certainly not infinite, but we do. And so if we share the mind of the Creator, we ought to be able to think God's thoughts after him, which is really a paraphrase, but a fairly accurate one of something that Kepler said once, that we really should be able to do that. But of course, we can't do it completely. Kepler and Galileo thought that mathematical laws were so good that we could literally know the mind of God completely as far as they were concerned. In those few cases where we could see the truth mathematically, we were just as certain about the truth as God. Kepler and Galileo both thought that. I'm a little more cautious about that myself. They both thought that was the case.
It seems a bit presumptuous, but
Jeff has a question I can see. I don't know if, Braden, are you moderating this, or I can't see everyone?
I am. I have Jeff next. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ed, good to see you, and thank you very much. So you have, I think, made a persuasive case for the consonance between Christian views of the fallibility of reason and divine sovereignty that underwrote scientific commitments to empiricism and to inductive inference. That's really helpful. But on the other hand, Descartes and the rationalists also had Christian commitments, and their views might have underwritten a science that went a different direction. And I'm wondering, what would you say to someone who might push back and say, the landscape of Christian views is so varied and so extensive that you could make a case for it being consonant with anything, and there's nothing intrinsic to the Christian worldview that is hospitable to science, as it has turned out. Much like some people point out that, the Bible has been used to justify racism and egalitarianism.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Well, Descartes certainly was a Christian philosopher. I'm not of the view that he wasn't. Some do hold that he wasn't. He was just kind of masquerading as a Christian. I think that's false. And he even considered the possibility that God might have made the world completely unintelligible. There he goes even further than Boyle or Newton will go in their claims about the world being dependent upon the will of God, which we cannot fathom. Descartes at one point in a correspondence he has with Meren Mersenne, he proposes the possibility that God could have made it true. The 2 + 2 is not 4. And now if God had done that, Descartes says, he would have had to have given us minds capable of comprehending that 2 + 2 is not 4, or in Descartes' view, God would be a deceiver. And so that's where Descartes falls back on. Ultimately, I think he uses that radical form of a voluntarist proposition that God is so free that he creates all the eternal truths, and he could have made different eternal truths. And he uses that as a foil, I think, to a voluntarist approach by saying that, then we wouldn't be able to know anything at all with any certainty. Well, I'm inclined to think maybe we don't, but Descartes thought we needed to. And so he dismisses that. The same way he dismisses the evil genie, with the proposition that what appears to be clear and distinct to us, clearly and distinctly true, must be true, or else again, God would be a deceiver. So Descartes toys with that, with giving God that kind of radical freedom, but he comes down really hard, I think, on the rationalist side. He felt that the laws of motion, the rules of motion is what he calls them, were a priori truths. You could arrive at these from metaphysical considerations. You didn't need any empirical input. But now the detailed structure of the world was more complicated than that. And God had a little more freedom there. He explicitly says, it puts it in that way. And so the world, to find out somehow how the world works in detail, we do have to go look. But the basic principles of physics come from pure reason for Descartes. So yeah, you can make a case for that. But in the history of Christian tradition, in Christian theology, there is a conversation that has 2 poles, at least, for our purposes here, at least, doctrine of creation. One pole is a voluntarist pole, in which God's freedom to do things that are even inscrutable to us is stressed. On the other pole is the rationalist pole, in which we have perfect access to the mind of God, and perfect access, therefore, to the creation, because we're made in God's image. And so that those poles are in tension with one another in the history of Christian theology. And that conversation about rationalism and voluntarism and empiricism in early modern science was conducted within a Christian context. And these thinkers that I've mentioned tonight were all of them explicit about the kinds of things that they believed about God, nature, and human knowledge of nature. So there's a big debate that takes place. But in the end, I think it's the voluntarists who come out on top. And I think they were theologically right. This is my personal theology taking over here. I think they were right. I think the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo basically requires us to be voluntarists in this respect. That God is going to create without any external conditions imposed on God, not even human reason. And so God can go out and do what God wants to do, and then we have to go out and see what God did.
Okay, we have Lisanne, then Paul, and then Stan.
Ted, hello, it's Lisanne. Nice to see you again.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yes, I just love your talks. I learned so much about our wonderful scientific tradition from the quotes. I don't know where you dig these quotes out of, but they're always spot on, so thank you. I really appreciated, Ted, how you unfolded for us the contribution of Christianity to science in terms of, science gives us all of this incredible knowledge, but it's limited, and so Christianity and understandings theologically can help understand more of the underlying reality of all things, right? Really well done. And so I want to ask you the flip side of that, Ted, tonight is, what do you see is the contribution of science to Christianity in terms of nature, all of creation, the mechanisms of science as being a communication of God and divine love and reaching to humanity? What can Christians glean from science in terms of a new form of spirituality, if anything?
Well, I don't know if we need a new form of spirituality that science might help us find, but certainly if you go with the psalmist, that the heavens are telling the glory of God, I guess that's Haydn's way of putting it, not the psalm, but the heavens are telling the glory of God. Are there Christians who don't believe that anywhere?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That they don't
There's a
believe
whole tradition, Ted, where the creation is corrupt. I mean, this comes right out of sort of very basic Calvinist Reformed theology that creation can't really tell us anything. Creation is fallen and corrupt, and so, in your opinion, what do you think the knowledge of nature is giving to Christians in terms of their understanding of who God is and what God might be speaking to us today?
Well, there's really two things there I want to speak to. In terms of the second part about what is it teaching us, what's it giving us? Well, I would be with someone like Jennifer Wiseman here. If you've heard Jennifer speak, she loves to stress the degree to which astronomical discoveries just awe us and overcome us with the majesty of the Creator. I would go very much with that. That's what I was thinking of when I said the heavens are telling the glory of God. The kind of intuitive response one has to some of these things. It's like, wow, it's amazing. The more you learn about this enormous universe, the more you learn about the enormity of the Creator. Someone like Nicholas of Cusa, thought that the universe might be infinite because it would be fitting an infinite Creator that would be one. So I would still say that, and with Boyle and with Kepler toward the end of the talk, how I stress that. Now, not sure what's happening.
So you would say that you're more of a Brunerian rather than a Barthian?
I have not read Brunner. I've read a little of Barth. But would Barth even deny that the heavens are telling the glory of God? Would his 9 go that far as to say that? I don't know.
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
but what I want to take up with you, though, what I would contend, thinking at least of you talked about the Reformed tradition, with the fallenness of creation, and that's fair. It's fair, but it's also fair, I think, to say that let's take one of the core Reformed documents about the Belgic Confession, and the Belgic Confession. Is it open with language about the books, or it's somewhere in there, somewhere near the front, I think, language about the 2 books, how God has revealed himself in the book of nature and the book of scripture, using that very, very old language going back to the patristics. And that's I don't think they would have said that the fallenness of humanity means that the book of nature is not a reliable revelation of God. I don't think they would have said that. Now, someone like Ken Ham might say that today, that fallen human beings with this and fallible human beings dealing with this fallen creation. How can we infer anything accurately from that to challenge the literalness of the Word of God? I mean, Ken Ham would say something like that. That's not where I am. I'm thinking of it through this historically, and I think Ken Ham would have been an outlier historically on this particular set of questions. So I would say that the fall is there, but to what extent does it mar that, right? Now, if you're Melanchthon, and Kepler follows Melanchthon, so if on these things, because Kepler got an MA in theology at Tübingen, and so Melanchthon says somewhere in the loci, he says that God gives us certain truths in our souls, implanted as part of the image of God. And in the context, I think he's talking about certain metaphysical truths, including mathematical truths. And these things aren't fallen for Melanchthon. The heavens didn't fall, only the earth did. And so we have mathematics, God's language. That's what they all see it as, God's language, mathematics. That language can be used to describe the heavens, which aren't fallen. And so Melanchthon's very enthusiastic about the practice of astronomy and, of course, the practice of astrology. He even writes a laudatory preface to the standard medieval astronomical textbook by John of Sacrobosco. And in there, he just praises it up and down, and partly because of its value to astrology. So, this is all there. Kepler follows Melanchthon. Kepler thinks that mathematics is the divine language. God is a geometer for Kepler. You know, he says God geometrizes eternally, and mathematics isn't fallen. And so the degree to which we can do mathematics is the degree to which we can read the mind of God. That's what Kepler means when he's quoted indirectly as saying science is thinking God's thoughts after. He doesn't directly say that, but he says something close to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ted. I appreciate you engaging me with that. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul's question is in the chat, but he can feel free to expand upon it if he'd like to. Can you see the question, Ted?
No, it's just sent it to you.
Oh, just to me. I'm sorry.
And it has to do with one common objection that Christianity actually held science is the seeming rejection, even polemic, against curiosity, treating curiosity as a vice, especially in Augustine, but also later among the scholastics, and that we only discovered that curiosity is important to science with the scientific revolution, or later on anyway.
I'd never considered that. I don't remember reading that in Augustine. Is that in the Confessions?
Well, he has the example of a friend who didn't want to be drawn into getting all excited about seeing people slaughtered in the Colosseum, but then he couldn't look away, and it sort of led him astray. It's a vice.
Well, you know, in general, Augustine's attitude toward the Greek natural philosophers, which were really the only tradition in town at the time, is not entirely favorable. He's, I'd say, somewhere toward the middle. He's no Tertullian. He doesn't think that Athens and Jerusalem should have nothing in common. But he cautions Christians indeed not to say, you know, when you hear a non-Christian saying something about the universe, then don't just fire a Bible verse off at him, basically, is what Augustine says. You know, these people aren't stupid, they have real knowledge. So he respects that they have real knowledge, but he doesn't think, you know, that this is anything really Christians ought to dwell on, because it's not germane to the kingdom of God. I think we have to keep in mind the fact that, as far as I can tell, the first Christian natural philosopher is Philoponus, and that's around 600 AD. Some would say Basil. I'm not convinced. I think that Philoponus really was a natural philosopher. He was doing what natural philosophers did at that time, namely writing detailed commentaries on Aristotle and the scientific works of Aristotle, that sort of thing. And prior to that point, then, as far as I can tell, there are no Christian natural philosophers. And the early church theologians are all responding to Greek natural philosophy. They're not creating it. So I think that does make a difference. You know, but Augustine's not a practitioner of natural philosophy. He's a user of it and a commentator on it.
Okay, thanks for your patience, Paul Wang. The question he wrote in chat says, if God is a mathematician, why can't supernatural be, quote, the science we'll never know, unquote? The cry of scientism may not longer be bad enough. And then if you'd like to expound upon that, please feel free, Paul.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, well, Bob Russell and Ken Peters will cringe at me even being here. I'm a urologist and therefore I've got a plumber brain. But I've always wondered, since scientism doesn't raise as much hairs on the neck of a scientist, of a theologian, as supernatural raises the hair on the neck of a scientist, why can't we say that because God's a mathematician, supernatural is something like the science we'll never know?
Well, Boyle pretty much says that. Boyle wrote a couple of works on things above reason is what he calls them. This is highly influential on John Locke, who was a close friend of Boyle, very close friend, and is younger than Boyle. But Boyle wrote a treatise on things above reason and then advices concerning things above reason. He felt that the human mind was not fully capable of grasping the divine mind. There were always going to be some propositions about God that were true that we wouldn't comprehend. They were, you could say, I suppose, supernatural truths. That's all I'm thinking of right now to say about this.
Well, supernatural, just once you say that word, the scientists shut down.
Yeah, I understand that.
And and since science is now becoming beautiful equations or something else you can't verify, why can't we say something like that, or think of a better word?
Well, again, Boyle calls these things above reason, truths above reason. Doesn't mean
Above our reason.
but he means above our reason. Correct, above our reason. It's the same kind of idea, I suppose, and I imagine there would be resistance to that as well. But then I'd like a scientist who is skeptical of God's existence to help me understand why it is the case that that same mathematics that we invent here on Earth in our minds looks like it's the right language to speak in the universe and even in other parts of the universe.
Because we don't have the circuitry for that mathematics.
Well, we do have the circuitry for a lot of that mathematics, which is why we can comprehend a lot of what God did, I would say.
Anyway, I'm sorry to embarrass Ted Peters, but I just had to ask that.
Okay, next we have Stan Klein.
Yeah, my question for you is, how can we get science and religion to work together in a healthier way than we're now doing?
If I had the answer to that, I'd be famous. Honestly, I don't know.
Well, I have a suggestion, which is for GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, and the University of California at Berkeley to start working together to connect science and religion. And we can do that locally.
Well, we do what we can, don't we? I think one small thing that people who know something about this could do is to look for ways to communicate with a larger public. I don't know how successful I may have been at that, probably not very. I've made a number of efforts to do that. I've tried writing not just for, academic journals, for a handful of other experts to read, but also for ordinary people to read, ordinary educated people at least, people who read, like Methodists, for example. You know what a Methodist is? It's a Baptist who can read. And so, it's an old joke, isn't it? But people who can read and they can go out and try to learn these things. I hope before I leave the world to be able to complete a book about Christianity and the rise of science. It's on the back burner right now because a book dealing with more modern issues is on the front burner and has to be there for the time being. But maybe at some point I'd be able to get that out there. I'd like to get that out there. But much more important is things I think that are not in print. And so, if there's filmmakers out there who want to make good film about these kinds of things, I'm all over that. I don't think that's very easy.
Joy, you're up next.
Hi there. I'm just kind of curious, how might we engage folks who have some training and are practitioners of a Christian faith tradition and who are trained as scientists across a variety of fields in conversation, because I really think we need to have discussions close in from people who hopefully have training in both areas, because I find it very unsettling to have things focused on very specific arguments that are relatively esoteric unless you've read deeply in philosophy and religion. And I find it's hard to have a discussion with scientists unless you get to sort of the creative and the inspiration and the awe and the joy in the joy in the discovery and the joy in the sharing of the discovery. If you put Christian tradition in language like that, many of the scientists I've worked with will recognize themselves in that creation and that imagination and that sense of joy and transformative discovery. And I'm just wondering whether we have missed sort of the essential piece that draws people to both things, which is a creativity and I'm the one who put in science being the study of God's elegant design, not laws of order, not of specific rules, but of the design which continually reveals itself and is unfolding.
Those conversations, I guess you probably know, those conversations at the high level, Bob is the number one facilitator of those conversations, in my opinion, at CTNS. And he's been doing it for a very long time. But if at the more popular level, perhaps, I have always found conversations about these things very, very helpful at the American Scientific Affiliation. I'm a longtime member of the ASA. And that's where I've met a number of the people that are here tonight in this space through that connection. The theologians usually don't show up in large numbers to that, ditto biblical scholars, but scientists do. And some of the scientists are not completely ignorant of these philosophical and theological things. And occasionally we do get a real genuine theologian like George Murphy. I know that George has probably been to your space a number of times. He's a regular at the American Scientific Affiliation. He'd probably be the sort of number one person in my mind in the ASA memberships who would be a real theologian by anyone's measurement. But there's not enough, I would say, such persons who come to ASA meetings on a regular basis. But those conversations usually are pretty interesting.
I can see the interest, and I don't want to belabor the point, but just as there's practical theology as an area of practice, I'm curious whether there's a way of taking this level of discussion and taking it to the pragmatic level, because the barrier I see is people who've studied religion and the history of science and philosophy of science often don't have the sense of discovery of a scientist who has worked long and hard in creating something or developing something, and so they don't have language that meets the emotional and attraction of it.
You say that scientists, you say, don't often have that. Is that what I heard? Is that what you said? I'm sorry.
No, actually, I'm saying that people who have studied, who are in faith traditions, have an assumption about scientists that prevent them being able to communicate effectively in emotive language in addition to analytical language.
Okay, interesting. That may be true.
Stephen Freiberg, you're next. We do have probably more comments or questions than we have time for, but I'll try and push through what I can.
So Stanley Klein and Joy asked the same question I wanted to ask you. So let me make a kind of variation. couple of weeks ago, we had somebody from BioLogos come out here, and I'd be very interested about your understanding of how well they're doing. And then kind of, you know, if you want to understand the future, one of the best things to do is talk to a historian who understands the past. So can you put on your future thinking hat, and where are we going? I mean, I want to ask the same question that Joy and Stanley are asking. Where are we going with this very convincing set of arguments that we have? And if we aren't going any place, what changes do we have to make? I think that's what Joy is asking.
Well, I'm a historian, I'm not a puppet. So if you want people to prognosticate, go find an astronomer. They have a closer relationship to astrology than historians do.
Okay, Mandolin is next.
Hello. I just wanted to ask if you would be able to name like the top 5 philosophers from your presentation that you think contributed the most to the discussion of science and religion.
Of the ones that I talked about tonight anyway, okay. Yeah. Start with Boyle. Boyle was a giant in early modern conversation about science and religion. He published about 750,000 words on these topics, and there's a lot more left unpublished. Some of it's profound. Now, he wasn't the world's greatest prose stylist. As someone once said accurately about him, he suffered from a remarkable inability to bring a sentence to a suitable close. But nevertheless, he was brilliant in many ways. And he wrestled with these science faith issues his whole adult life. He struggled with religious doubt from start to finish. Most people don't know that about him, but he did. He said when he was 20 years old, he said, "He whose faith never doubted may justly doubt his faith." And he spent the next 45 years of his life exploring issues about faith and learning, not just science, but all kinds of learning. So I would start with Boyle, of all places. But there's other philosophers in here too that I think are profound at times. Kepler's amazing. He's my all-time favorite figure in the history of science. One of the nice things about him is that he never pulls punches in his writings, and he always tells you about all the dead ends and lost causes he's investigated. And he doesn't hesitate to turn his scientific works into theological works, into really works of praise. It just pours out of him all the time, unlike almost anybody else you can find in the history of science. So, you know, you can read some Boyle, read some Kepler. But my favorite of the ideas I presented here, probably my favorite person to read is John Polkinghorne. John is, I guess, no longer active. He's pretty old now, he's 90. But it's still the case that he's done a lot of original work in his life that is highly quotable, very thoughtful. Not always right necessarily, I'm sure Bob would say, I would say, but often right about things. And I would read some John Polkinghorne. So that's 3 names right there anyway, where there's a kind of positive conversation about these things going on.
TDS, and then Scott will be our last question, and then I'll ask Ted to wrap up. And there are a couple questions in the chat if you want to refer to those in any of your final comments as well, Ted, if you want to take a look.
Need to unmute here. My name is Tom Schneider. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm a biologist, and so I often think in terms of biology, and I've read Wigner's Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics, 1960 copies anyway, and it occurred to me that there are lots of mathematics. I just heard recently there are many pieces of mathematics which have no connection at all, apparently, to the current universe, although people often get stunned when they find out that a piece of math does match the universe. And so I think an answer to the question of why mathematics works may simply be that we select the mathematics in the Darwinian sense. So there are lots of math out there, and we bumble around until we find a mathematics that works, and we nail it to the evidence, and then you end up with a prediction machine, which is why it works. This happened in my work. I started out looking for mathematics to understand biology, and eventually came across information theory. And now I many times I'm very stunned at how precise that connection becomes. And related to the earlier conversation, there are definitely moments of euphoria when suddenly a whole door opens up. But I don't see anywhere in this gods. It's entirely me stumbling around, finding a math that connects to the biology, and then pushing it and seeing how far it goes. And there are limits. And the way you make sure your math is right is by looking at the evidence and seeing whether or not it connects. So that's a thought for you. And maybe we could discuss that more if you want.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I would want to think about that. I wouldn't be able to respond to it, in an effective way, probably. I have thought about it. It's a very interesting idea. But the point I was trying to make wasn't about specific types of mathematics at all. It was just the general proposition that mathematics, that way of thinking about the world, has been extraordinarily fruitful in dealing with nature.
Yeah.
So why is nature really does seem to be mathematically structured, regardless of the type of mathematics it turns out you need in a given application?
Because we select the subparts of mathematics for particular problems. So information theory turns out to match how if you want to study how proteins bind to DNA, you can use information theory to characterize the binding sites in bits of information. And it turns out that works. And if you think about it deeply enough, which I have, you can understand exactly why it works. It's nothing mysterious when you get down into it, although in some sense it's amazing. But as I said, and we don't have all the mathematics. There's a lot of math out there that people are not using, apparently. I heard this just the other day. And so we have many to look at. And maybe it may be that some of that math next year will connect to something, or maybe it never will. But the mathematicians, they don't care. They just go and they construct some axioms, and they go running off and seeing what the results are. And then somebody else comes along and says, oh my goodness, that matches my problem in physics. And now you have a predicting machine. It's like a little computer that can predict things. And in science, of course, there are limits to that. And in my work, in a number of cases, the mathematics failed, if you will. In other words, the prediction failed, and then you have a choice, and the choice is you either throw out all this nice machinery that works, or you say, well, I'm missing some piece of biology. And we believe that that's what happened. We can explain the results in terms of pieces of biology that we didn't know about, and then the thing becomes a consistent figure. It's like the orbit of Mercury with Einstein originally, right? That orbit did not match Newtonian mechanics. And it ended up that you needed an Einsteinian mechanics or Einsteinian space-time to understand it, right? So it opened up a new door and beyond Newtonian mechanics. Some things to think about.
Okay, our last question of the evening is from Scott. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for your great talk. I'm the layman amongst this crowd, so it's very intimidating. But building kind of on Dr. Klein's comment about the science and religion working together, why would the scientific community be interested in that? Like, what's in it for them? Like, I have a little Richard Dawkins always at the back of my head, thinking of how he'd react to things, and I can see him just looking curious and thinking, well, yeah, why would I bother with a bunch of superstitious people? What are they going to do for me? So yeah, so what's the appeal? Why would scientists want to work with theologians or be interested at all in the religious questions?
Well, I don't suggest that every scientist would.
No. Well, how would you sell it though? If you were trying to start a conversation, how would you sell it?
Well, Polkinghorne suggests that both science and religion are searches for motivated belief. And that might be a common place to start. He also speaks of these as cousinly disciplines, I think in part because of that, because they're searches for motivated belief. In part, I think a scientist has to give herself or himself permission to ask these deeper metaphysical questions that scientists have always asked, always. You know, not every individual scientist puts emphasis on these, but in the history of science, these things are all over the landscape when scientists themselves raise metaphysical questions. In my view, metaphysical questions are at the heart of science, and they tend to get buried way down deep and only come up to the surface where people are aware of them when there's a scientific revolution going on. So an example of that would be, of course, 20th century when new quantum theory comes along, quantum mechanics comes along in the late 20s. All those conversations, you know, Bohr and Einstein and everybody else, where Bohr ends up saying to Einstein, stop telling God what to do, and these kinds of things. Those conversations are real. They're about metaphysical issues at the heart of science. And they tend to get, they do tend to get buried, I think, most of the time by scientists. The only time I can remember seeing them as a physics student myself was in one chapter of the textbook we had on quantum mechanics. We had the one by Dickey and Whitke. And that particular quantum mechanics book has a chapter on interpretation of quantum mechanics. I don't remember what they called the chapter. I don't have the book anymore. But you know, that's the only time I ever remember seeing them up front and central in the scientific conversation. But there's deeper questions all the way down. If you've ever read the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, for example, you'll see conversations in there about the relativity of space and time, for example. And these things aren't new for Einstein to start thinking about. So they're there. And the Greek natural philosophers were aware of this. They, of course, called science natural philosophy. That's an Aristotelian term, because they recognized that these metaphysical questions are unavoidable when you're going to be dealing with nature. So maybe I would start there. That's the type of argument I was basically constructing tonight, that there are metaphysical issues in science, issues in which scientists themselves have often expressed deep interest, often voiced these questions. And they're very similar to the kinds of questions that Christian theologians ask themselves. So that's the type. If this isn't a conversation starter, then maybe I'm not going to be able to start that conversation. But this would be maybe my effort to do that.
Is another possibility that, you know, there's a lot of talk about anti-science, you know, especially in the U.S. or North America maybe, and you know, that's certainly perceived as a threat by the scientific community.
For sure.
Yeah, so you know, I mean, just on that basis alone, it's always better to engage and talk than just to war with each other, you know. And I'm wondering if that's a reason, you know.
Yeah, I know, I think so. Some observers of scientists have noted, I think I agree with this, that science doesn't come with its own public policy implications. Those are beyond the pay grade of scientists, but they tend to get confused in the public conversation. So people on the political right who don't want to see something like the Green New Deal put into place are going to try to deny the science behind it, which of course is a fundamental error on their part. But there's nothing wrong, in my view, with them raising questions about what should the public policy implications be of all of this. What are the costs all the way around to humanity in trying to deal with this? You know, after all, we have all these great universities in our country that come up with the whole notion of climate change in the first place. And if you take a long historical view, to a significant degree, these universities all pretty much depend on the wealth created by the Industrial Revolution and by the burning of all these fossil fuels that got us to this point. And so, you know, there we are. And so it's not such a simple thing after all, is it? And so, but you know, they hear these public policy proclamations in the name of science, you see, and they know they don't agree with the public policy proclamation, so they think the science must be rotten. I think the same is true for many people of evolution, that when you have people like George Gaylord Simpson, the great Harvard paleontologist, saying years ago that man was evolved, not created, where he really meant we weren't created at all. There's no sense in which we're created. Or someone like, you know, Richard Dawkins thinking that if evolution is true, God doesn't exist. And then, of course, you have on the other hand, Ken Ham saying if evolution is true, God is a liar and the Bible isn't true. Jesus didn't die for your sins if evolution is true. So the things that parade themselves out there as science, we sometimes have to unpack them, you know, we have to unpack them. A very good sociologist of science that I know, I won't use his name in this context because it was said informally in a meeting 35 years ago, but once described looking at science and religion as undressing two transvestites, because you had science masquerading itself as religion and religion masquerading itself as science on many occasions. I'm sympathetic to that observation.
Thank you, Ted. I'll leave it at that. Ted, do you want to give us any final comments before we close tonight?
I really have nothing to add except appreciation to everyone for showing up and listening to an old guy talk about some ideas, many of which were pretty old, maybe half-baked. And thanks again for turning out, and for Bob and Melissa for making this possible.
Thanks, Ted. It was a fantastic lecture. And for all of you here, it will be on our website eventually, and so you can see it again. We will come back next spring with 3 more online events. We'll keep you posted. Visit the CTNS website, www.ctns.org, if you want to learn more. Think about becoming a member. And for now, I wish you a good evening. And let's give Ted a round of thanks before we good night.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ted.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.